control, T-minus 54 minutes and counting. T-minus 54 minutes and counting. Earlier this morning, the cryogenics were loaded aboard the Saturn V space vehicle. The flight crew then came aboard and is now on board, completing a series of communications checks. The weather continues to be clear as it's supposed to be for our launch time, and we continue to aim for launch at 12:54 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The command communications
NBC News, the flight of Apollo 16, brought to you by the Gulf Oil Corporation, producers of more and better energy from oil.
Nighttime at Cape Kennedy is not quite like nighttime anywhere else. It gets very quiet, but somewhere out there, machines are running softly, radar is tracking, and computers are ticking away in the night. And when you look at the moon from Cape Kennedy, it makes you think of a lot of things. It makes you think about the Earth, moving through space around the sun and revolving at 900 miles an hour. And you think about Cape Kennedy as a sort of a platform on that moving, revolving object. And you realize that they send rockets from here which have to travel 250,000 miles out into space and land precisely on another revolving object which itself is rushing through space at 2,000 miles an hour. It's enough to give a man a headache. But one is also led to think about the magic of the moon, and when you look at it from here, you say to yourself, could we really have landed men on the moon and got them back? The conscious mind says yes, but the old subconscious rebels, because the old subconscious has been trained in myths and superstitions about the moon, fed on images of a green cheese moon, smiled at by the man in the moon, and warned about lunatics. There's a poem which says, even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. A man in Brazil took his child out of school last week because the child had been taught that man had walked on the moon. The father said that was an invention of newspapers and professors who don't believe in God. Well, it's not an invention. Man has walked on the moon. It's just that when you look at the moon, that's hard to believe.
Sorry for the loss of sound on that. After liftoff at Cape Kennedy, we'll be following the flight of Apollo 16 here in New York, and with me will be John Chancellor and Edwin Newman. And we'll be following not only the technical side of this flight, that is the lunar landing, the transposition and docking, and the moon walks, but we'll be also looking at the human side of this Apollo 16 mission, what it means for 3 men to go to the moon, to fly around it, and to land there. That's what we'll be trying to do and we'll be doing. Of course, the headquarters for the Apollo 16 mission is in Houston, Texas, and there with us and reporting for us will be NBC News correspondents Roy Neal and Jim Hartz.
Thank you, Gary. Well, if you can talk about a kingdom of technology, the Manned Spacecraft Center here is certainly the palace, and the picture that you see behind me is the throne room where the kings and the dukes and the barons and the earls control the flight. And their estates are not landed, but they are computers, and in various rooms around the Mission Control Center there are these computers and various Spear carriers to help out the Dukes and the Earls, and their fervent wish is that they won't be needed, that the flight will go according to plan, and that they will have absolutely nothing to do. About the only thing missing is a court jester. But we do have a court reporter, and he's on the floor. Roy Neal. Roy?
Well, Jim, here on the floor in Apollo Control, Flight Director Eugene Krantz has been checking with his flight controllers, and they're reporting go for liftoff at this hour. The worldwide tracking network, the recovery forces, the computer complexes, all set for the liftoff of Apollo 16. Once the spacecraft clears the launch tower at the Cape, Houston takes over control of the flight. And at that time, we'll hear John McLeish begin his reports from the Public Affairs Console on the far side to the rear of this room. And astronaut Gordon Fullerton will be the Capcom in voice contact with the astronauts in space. Now, that title, Capcom, goes back to the days when spacecraft were called capsules, and the control room astronaut was called the capsule communicator. Apollo 16 is the 26th manned United States spaceflight, and mission control right now is ready for it. Well, the mood here is one of quiet confidence. There's very little noise in this room as the controllers talk to one another through these special headsets and communication circuits. At the moment, I'm monitoring the main flight director's loop, and Gene Krantz is still getting go reports from all stations. Flight dynamics, guidance, medical monitor, tracking network, recovery, all stations reporting looking good. Jim?
Thank you, Roy. So in about 45 minutes, these will be busy men, and for the next 12 days, they'll be busy men. Now back to the Cape.
We're back here in New York, not at the Cape, because we have a certain amount of technical difficulty in getting John Chancellor's voice here. We have his picture, but not the voice. There are no real or serious technical problems as far as the launching itself is concerned, and that is the important thing. The Apollo 16 astronauts are aboard the Apollo spacecraft. They will be lifting off at 54 minutes after the hour for their half or quarter of a million-mile trip to the moon. We'll be covering that, and later on in this program, we'll also be giving an idea of what these astronauts will be doing, the various critical stages they have to go through today. There are 3 critical maneuvers. One, of course, is liftoff itself, to get off the Earth. The second one is, after they're in Earth orbit, to go into TLI, which is the translunar insertion. That's the technical description of it. What it really means is that is the start of their trip towards the moon. And the third critical maneuver is transposition and docking, when they link up with the lunar module. We'll be talking about that in just a moment, and watching the liftoff itself from Cape Kennedy. Right now, we'll pause for a word from Gulf.
In about 45 minutes, the Apollo 16 moon mission ought to begin. We can foresee no delays, no holdups in the countdown, which has been proceeding normally all morning. A lot of people here at Cape Kennedy, as usual, for one of these. The Vice President arrived. Vice President Agnew arrived here just a few minutes ago. King Hussein of Jordan, who's visiting the United States, is a guest here today, interested in space, and he'll see that site, as you will, in, as I say, 45 minutes, when the Apollo 16 astronauts, John Young, Ken Mattingly, and Charles Duke, start their 12-day voyage to the moon, landing in the Descartes highlands of the moon for an excursion, 3 extravehicular excursions in their rover car, which will take them about 25 miles around on the moon's surface, and we'll be watching much of that on television. This is, in terms of the Apollo program, one of the long J missions. But now, in a minute, we're going to get Chuck Hollinshead from the voice of Apollo, who's going to give us a report on the countdown.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 43 minutes and counting. A critical power transfer test was just conducted. During this test, the flight vehicle batteries take on the workload, having been shared up to that point by an external source. We've gone back to that external source again, and we'll stay on that, saving the flight batteries until the final minute, approximately 50 seconds in the countdown. Superintendent of Range Operations just reported that the Kennedy Space Center is clear for launch. Now, T-minus 42 minutes, 30 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
As you can see, the Apollo 16 launch vehicle is poised here on pad 39A at Cape Kennedy, ready for its trip to the moon. But unlike all the other Apollo launch rockets, this one has been on that pad before. Apollo 16's fully assembled launch vehicle was rolled out of the assembly building on its 1-mile-an-hour journey to pad 39A last December. It was carried by a specially built transporter designed to lift the 12 million pound load, and on this occasion, wives and children of the spaceport workers were invited to watch as the rocket was set in place on the pad. But later, technicians tested the system and damaged a fuel tank aboard the spacecraft. This meant that the whole rocket assembly had to be brought back for repairs, all the way back to the huge assembly building at that same slow 1 mile-an-hour pace. Inside the building, cranes lifted the spacecraft assembly off the Saturn booster rockets, took it to another building, and started to work. After removing the heat shield, it was a fairly simple matter to replace the damaged tank. A helium pressure test had ruptured a bladder inside a tank that fueled the spacecraft control system. Although solving the problem was a simple matter, the logistics involved in moving this spacecraft around caused a 1-month delay in the launch of Apollo 16. It was the only hitch so far in the flawless launch record for manned trips to the moon, but as we can see, they are there now, and they're getting ready to go. We normally use our own cameras to show you these events, but there are a number of cameras that NASA has here, and we've made some use of them. While our view of the Apollo Saturn vehicle liftoff is usually restricted to an average of 6 cameras, the people who launch it use 60 cameras. Besides watching the launch, the engineers here use the cameras to monitor critical positions, to look at dials, wires, and pipes all over the spacecraft and its launch rocket. Using only 30 of their 60 cameras, we are going to look at what the engineers now are looking at here. Some of the dials and gadgets won't mean anything to you or to me, but they mean a lot to the engineers. The numbers in the upper left-hand corner there are the numbers of the cameras, and this enables the engineers.
Underway at this time are some checks of the range safety command system. During these checks, a signal is sent to receivers aboard the 3 stages of the Saturn V launch vehicle. This receiver is connected to destruct packages aboard the vehicle. If the vehicle should stray off path due to a malfunction, the range safety officer could elect to send signals by way of these receivers to the destruct package. This would be done only after the astronaut crew, of course, had executed their abort and were well away from the vehicle. During these tests, the signals are sent with the destruct packages in an unarmed condition. It's a check to ensure that the signals are reaching the destruct packages, or at least for the test, reaching the receiver. The swing arm now in the 12-degree position or arc position. The astronaut crew aboard the spacecraft now in an emergency situation could use their launch escape tower to clear themselves well away from the spacecraft from the space vehicle in an emergency. In such an emergency, they would be carried to the proper altitude at which the regular spacecraft parachutes would deploy, and the crew would then make a normal recovery. They also have the option with the swing arm at the 12-degree position to call it back, where they could quickly then go across the swing arm, again having an option of either taking an elevator to a safe area at the bottom of the pad, or a slide wire which has a cab attached to it which would carry them to the pad perimeter. These would be decisions depending on the type of emergency. In the Launch Control Center, the Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, just walked into the viewing room. He will plans to view the launch from here. Now, T-minus 38 minutes, 6 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
Roy Neal in Mission Control. And Flight Director Gene Kranz and some of his flight controllers have just detected what could be a major problem. Apparently, there has been a breakdown in circuits between the Goddard Computer Complex in Greenbelt, Maryland, and a releasing station, a main releasing station in Monrovia, Virginia. As a result, this could affect all data circuits worldwide, which are, of course, necessary for this launch. The status right now is that the flight director has asked his communications people to give him a status report in about 7 minutes from now. If this occasions a hold while repairs are made, that hold would be made at minus 22 minutes in the count. Now, that's the status right now in Mission Control. Garrett?
Thank you, Roy. We'll see what happens in the next few minutes, whether this is could be a real major problem, as you see, or one which can be cleared up. As of right now, the liftoff from Cape Kennedy is scheduled for 54 minutes after this hour, and we'll see what happens then. This, as we said earlier, is an Apollo 16 flight, which is perhaps one of the most sophisticated and complicated technical efforts man has ever undertaken. But amid all of these tubes and these buttons and these rockets and all of this fuel, there are these three men who are going to go 250,000 miles to the moon. They're going to circle around it and land on it and walk on it and drive on it, and then they're going to come away from it and come back to Earth and to the United States. So when we talk about these people, it's good to know who they are and what their background is, that they are not faceless men, but they are human beings. And we want to do that right now and give you an idea of who the three astronauts are. This crew of Apollo 16 includes two newcomers to space flight and one old hand, or one space veteran. Command ship pilot Ken Mattingly and lunar lander pilot Charles Duke have never flown before in space, but the mission commander, John Young, has made 3 previous flights into space. Young, a 41-year-old Navy captain, was selected in the second group of astronauts back in 1962. His first flight into space was also the first manned flight in the Gemini series. Young was the pilot for Gemini 3, a 3-orbit flight designed to test the systems in the 2-man launch series. His command pilot was Gus Grissom, one of the original 7 astronauts. Grissom later died in a fire during an Apollo series test. Gemini 3 was launched in March 1965 and was called a success. Young and Grissom accomplished the first manned orbital trajectory modifications. That means simply they changed their own flight path. In 1966, Young was the command pilot for Gemini 10, a rendezvous and docking mission that included a spacewalk. The Gemini 10 spacecraft caught up to and docked with a target vehicle, an Agena. Young then relighted the Agena's engine, which kicked the dock combination into a 476-mile-high orbit, a record altitude at the time.
The launch. At the T-minus 1 minute mark, the flame deflector underneath the 5 Saturn V first stage engines will start.
Later in the Gemini mission, pilot Michael Collins went outside the spacecraft to retrieve some equipment from another target vehicle. The flight was concluded successfully 3 days later, 2 miles from the recovery ship. Young, a native of Orlando, Florida, near Cape Kennedy, was the command module pilot for Apollo 10. The mission was designed to be a complete test of the launch, flight, and moon landing vehicles without actually landing on the moon. Young, like most of his fellow astronauts, is a test pilot with military training in all types of aircraft. With Young on this flight were test pilots Tom Stafford, the mission commander, and lunar module pilot Gene Cernan. Apollo 10 was launched from Cape Kennedy on May 18, 1969, in what was to be a dress rehearsal for the first moon landing just a few months later. On their way to the moon, Commander Stafford demonstrated some of the effects of weightlessness using his command pilot as an example. The more serious side of the mission included the lunar module separation and descent to within 10 miles of the moon's surface. After a few anxious moments when the lunar ascent stage gyrated wildly on the way back to the command ship, the mission ended successfully with a near-perfect recovery. Now, after 3 successful flights into space, Young's mission includes walking on the surface of the moon. The command module pilot for Apollo 16 is Ken Mattingly, a 36-year-old Navy lieutenant commander. Mattingly was picked with the 5th group of astronauts in 1966 and has never flown in space. He was named command module pilot for Apollo 13, but exposure to measles just 72 hours before the flight caused his replacement by John Swigert. Trouble aboard the service module cut Apollo 13's flight short. Mattingly, grounded behind a Houston control panel, worked with the flight controllers that devised a way for the Apollo 13 crew to bring themselves back to Earth safely, using their moon landing ship as a lifeboat. As command module pilot for Apollo 16, Mattingly will stay aboard his orbiting spacecraft while mission commander John Young and LEM pilot Charles Duke are on the surface. He'll conduct mapping and photography exercises along with other experiments. Then, after rendezvous with Young and Duke, on the way home, he will go outside the spacecraft to recover film magazines from the service module. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Charles Duke will be the lunar module pilot for Apollo 16, and he'll explore the moon's surface along with Mission Commander John Young. Duke is a 36-year-old member of the 5th astronaut class. He was recruited in 1966. He has served as a member of the astronaut support crew for Apollo 10 and was the backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 13. Duke, a test pilot and instructor for the F-104 Phantom fighters, is familiar with a variety of aircraft in the Air Force arsenal. He has spent a lot of time getting familiar with new ones in recent months. This odd-looking craft is designed to simulate the landing characteristics of the lunar lander. It requires a new set of flying disciplines and skills for most pilots. Duke and Mission Commander John Young will have to land their lunar module with more care than most of the other previous landings. Their target area on the moon is a hilly region known as the Descartes. It's a region which is representative of the moon, and that's where they are going to land. Those are the 3 men who will be going to the moon. Now let's go back to John Chancellor and Cape Kennedy.
We should know in just a minute or two if the communications problem that has developed in the computers between the Goddard Center in Maryland and another center in Virginia is enough to hold up this operation. But here at the Cape, they have begun pouring water into the launch pad to cool it off, and that means that they intend to get the rocket off, and that should happen in about a half an hour. You know, when you look at the pictures of Young and Mattingly and Duke, one or two things do come to mind. Young is kind of a jokester. When he was on Gemini 3 long ago, instead of taking along the sort of toothpaste food astronauts were then and now asked to carry, he brought along a corned beef sandwich, one of the more human moments in the space program. And Mattingly and Duke have an unusual relationship. Mattingly was supposed to go to the moon on Apollo 13, that ill-fated venture that didn't make it to the moon, but he got bumped off before they left because a backup crewman got the German measles. Well, the backup crewman was Charles Duke, who is going today. All here is well, and we'll be launching, I would think, in about a half an hour, and we'll be back after this message from Gulf. No matter how many times you witness an Apollo launch here at Cape Kennedy, it is always a fantastic spectacle, even for those of us who've been coming here for some time. Those 3 men inside the spacecraft committing their lives to a trip to the moon and back again. The thunder of sound rumbling across the ground from the pad where you stand, and you can see it go up. David Brinkley once said the noise made the loose change in his pocket jingle, and some people cry when the rocket goes off. So we've got some scenes now from previous launches to show you. We were listening to the voice of Apollo while you were watching that film, and the voice said, it's go for countdown, which means they're still continuing the countdown, even though they're looking at two problems. One is the communications problem we mentioned a few minutes ago on the lines between computers in Maryland and computers in Virginia. The other is a thing called a backup yaw gyro. The backup yaw gyro is part of the mechanism which helps to position the rocket as it goes through space. They don't think, we've been looking at this all morning ourselves, the people we talk to don't think it's a serious problem. It may just be a light here on the ground. Nevertheless, the countdown goes on. As they are looking at that, we'll continue to look at it after this message from Gulf.
NBC News continues with its coverage of Apollo 16, brought to you by the Gulf Oil Corporation, producers of more and better energy from oil. Here again is John Chancellor.
The problem that they had, if indeed it is a problem here at Cape Kennedy, with the yaw gyro has been solved, or perhaps shelved is a better way to put it. They have looked at all the possible dangers it could bring to the mission. They have found that those are only minimal or non-existent, and so they have been given a go for launch. That would be at 12:54 Eastern Standard Time in about a half an hour. They are on the rocket now, topping off the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen fuels, and the weather here continues fine. So it looks like a very good countdown in this series. They will take off this afternoon on the 16th of April, and they will arrive in the vicinity of the moon on Wednesday. They will land Thursday afternoon and begin a series of extravehicular activities, as it's called here, in the lunar highlands. Garrick Utley has been looking into what this mission means and what they'll do. Garrick, are you there?
Yes, John, I am. The mathematics of getting from the Earth to the moon were worked out long before man ever went to the moon, and the flight path for Apollo 16 will be pretty much like flight paths for the previous Apollo missions. Here's what I mean. This globe represents the Earth. Now, the Earth is really 8,000 miles across. This is only 1 foot as you see it from the side. It's been reduced in scale, as everything has been here, except me. The Apollo 16 astronauts will lift off from Cape Kennedy. They'll go around the Earth for less than 1 complete orbit. And then over the Pacific Ocean, they will ignite their engines, which will send them out of the Earth's gravitational pull and on their way towards the moon. Shortly after that, they will go through a stage called transposition and docking. That's when they separate and then dock with a lunar module. After that is completed, the space vehicle will look like this. Lunar module here, the crew and the command space module here, and that's the way they will go to the moon. The trip itself then, or what they call the coast, will run for 3 days. It's 250,000 miles to the moon. Along the way, they can make mid-course corrections if any are necessary. Then on Wednesday, they'll arrive at the moon. They'll go into orbit around it, get into position for landing. That landing will occur on Thursday. 2 of the astronauts will go down in the lunar module. They'll spend 3 days on the moon's surface, walking and riding around. They'll be raking up samples of lunar soil. They'll be picking up moon rocks. They'll be setting up scientific experiments, and they'll be taking pictures of just about everything they see there. The 3rd astronaut, Ken Mattingly, will remain in the spacecraft orbiting the moon. He'll be supervising a series of scientific experiments and photographs of the moon. And then, a week from today, the rendezvous will occur. The 2 astronauts will lift off from the moon. They will rejoin Ken Mattingly, and they will then start their trip back to Earth. On the way back, they will eject 1 sub-satellite, which will stay behind and orbit the moon to carry out further scientific experiments. Halfway back, there will be a spacewalk by astronaut Mattingly. He is going to go out of the space vehicle and retrieve some film cassettes. These are pictures taken automatically of the moon during the 3 days orbit of the moon. After that, if all goes normal, it will be a relaxed ride back to Earth. They will arrive here on Friday, April 28th, when they re-enter the atmosphere, and they will splash down in the Pacific near the Christmas Islands south and a little to the east of Hawaii. For me, it was just about a 30-foot walk. For them, it was almost 500,000 miles. Now let's go back to John Chancellor at the Cape.
About T-minus 17 minutes now to the launch, and everything is going well here. The recovery forces have notified the authorities here that they are ready to do their work, need it be done in case there's something that goes wrong with the rocket after it lifts off the ground. The power dropout in a communications network between Maryland and, I think, West Virginia has been solved by the use of a backup system. So in about 15 minutes, it's going to be very, very exciting here, and the countdown will get much closer in about 10. We'll be back with all of that after this message from Gulf. All well here at Cape Kennedy. Launch at 12:54 Eastern Standard Time. In just a few minutes, the astronauts, John Young, Ken Mattingly, and Charles Duke, are in the spacecraft. They've been in there since 10:39 this morning, working on their dials and switches and making sure that everything is ready. They began their adventure at 7:39 this morning. That's when they woke up in their crew quarters, which is 9 miles from where we are here at pad 39A. The astronauts normally have routines for breakfast, and here they are having breakfast. The astronauts themselves had to eat steak and eggs. That's a special diet they have, but their guests had other things. Some of them had bacon and eggs. That's Young there, John Young, having his breakfast. He's now in the spacecraft on his way to the moon. Other people, Deke Slayton, members of the backup crew, Stuart Rosa and Ed Mitchell, were at the breakfast. Dave Bauer, the leader of their support group. That's Young suiting up. Complicated business getting into those terribly expensive suits. That's Duke. Charles Duke, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force, getting into his. And that's Ken Mattingly, getting into his suit. He will fly the command module called Casper, for Casper the Ghost, as they circle around the moon.
Crew for Apollo 16.
Here they come. This is one of the classic scenes in American life today. The astronauts coming out carrying their life support packages. They're all sealed in there. They get oxygen and all the rest of it from those bags they carry. Other people wearing their white suits getting into the van. It's a 9-mile drive over here, and that was earlier this morning. Mrs. Young and Mrs. Duke are here to see the launch. Mrs. Mattingly is expecting a child about the time he gets back, so she stayed home in Houston. There's one of those cameras we showed you before, one of the NASA cameras with the little numbers in the upper left-hand corner. And there they are, getting ready to go up in the elevator into what is called, into the launch tower. Obviously, this is not happening now, everybody. This happened before 10 o'clock this morning. There they are, walking across a swing arm from the launch tower into what is called the White Room. The White Room is located next to the space vehicle itself, where they sit on the top of this enormous rocket. They are about 363 feet up in the air, about 350 feet when they're sitting in there. Way up high there, the top of an enormous building. The test conductor, a man named Skip Chauvin, said, "Welcome to the spacecraft." And Young said, "Good morning, it's great to be here." And Mattingly, speaking of the weather, said, "Good morning. It's a pretty one, isn't it?" And so they're in there now, sitting, as one astronaut once said, on top of a lot of equipment that was built by people who made the low bid. But it's worked so far, tens of millions of parts, and there's no reason now why it won't work today. As we say, the weather here at the Cape is perfect. We are going to try to track this rocket when it leaves here. We're going to try to track it as far as we possibly can. So you may get today several minutes of marvelous shots of seeing that rocket go out across the Atlantic and up into the air as swiftly as it does. When we were here the last time for Apollo 15, you'll recall we had cloud cover, and the rocket went up and was lost in the clouds very quickly. But today, as we look out the window here, there are only one or two little tiny clouds, and they're down at what appear to be about the 5,000 or 10,000 foot level, and they're hardly clouds at all. And the sky is a beautiful blue, and we should be able to see this going very quickly, and it isn't going to be very long now before it does start to go. The problem with the communications is over. The problem with the gyro, the yaw gyro, is over. The countdown is proceeding into its final stages now. The swing arms are starting to come back, almost all back from the rocket, and it looks as though nothing is going to stand in the way of these men getting to the moon, as far as we can tell now. In just a second or two, we'll have Chuck Hollinshead, the voice of Apollo, with an update announcement.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 10 minutes and counting, and we just heard from the spacecraft commander, John Young, that Casper and Orion are go for launch. The spacecraft is now on full internal power. Up to this point, it's been sharing its power load with the ground supply. A short time ago, the Astrocom circuit was checked out. This is the circuit that the astronauts will be on during the launch phase. They'll be on this with Stoney, the astronaut communicator here in the Launch Control Center, the Launch Operations Manager, Paul Donnelly, and the spacecraft test supervisor, Skip Chauvin. The crew actually goes onto the Astrocom circuit at the T-minus 4-minute mark in the countdown. Our weather continues to look good for launch as we aim toward a 12:54 p.m. Eastern Standard Time liftoff. Now at T-minus 9 minutes, 11 seconds, and counting, this is Kennedy Launch Control.
Casper and Orion are two words that you'll hear about during this Apollo 16 mission. Casper is the command module that will circle the moon once they get there, and Orion is the lunar module which will land on the moon. Orion is a star. They chose it because it's bright and important to their navigation. Casper is named after Casper the Ghost, a television comic character, and there is a mixture of both humor and seriousness in those two names. We will be back now, launch, in about 8.5 minutes, so we're going to bring you all of that after this. Launch in 7 minutes and 23 seconds now, the spacecraft on various kinds of internal power, everything ready to go here at Cape Kennedy. Should anything go wrong, you'll notice on the top of the spacecraft there what looks like a long pointed nose. Actually, that's called the Launch Escape Tower. And if something goes wrong, even now at this moment, and they have to get away from all that fuel they're sitting on, they can press various buttons, and that is actually a jet. It will pull them off in their spacecraft, off the tower. It has been armed. It was armed about a half an hour ago, and it's ready to go. Now, if they take off, when they take off, and should something go wrong, that escape tower still is important to them. Up until about 3 minutes into the flight, if something goes wrong, they can separate from the Saturn rocket below them and be pulled away by that rocket and dropped about 500 miles out into the Atlantic, safe in their spacecraft. Or if they have trouble even later in the launch phase, the command module can separate and land 3,000 miles downrange. Nobody's ever tried that. Now, let's listen to the voice of Apollo, Chuck Hollinshead.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We're now passing the 6-minute mark in the countdown. Emergency detection system has now been placed in the launch mode. Houston Flight has also indicated that they are go for the automatic sequencer. At the T-minus 3 minute 7 second mark, the launch will go on the automatic sequencer, and from that point on, the launch will be automatically handled by the sequencer. Coming up on the T-minus 5 minute and 30 second mark, at that time we'll be standing by for a go to launch from Mission Director Chet Lee. Mission Director verifies go for launch. Mission Director Chet Lee from Houston verifies go for launch. All elements now reporting into Test Supervisor Gordon Turner that they are go for launch. Now T-minus 5 minutes, 13 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
So again, we're going to have a look at the performance of the Saturn V rocket, a three-stage rocket of enormous power and thrust, which has worked perfectly in all of these launches. It's been a marvelous vehicle to get men up into orbit and to send them off toward the moon. It's pretty big. It weighs 6.5 million pounds there as it sits on the pad. And when they turn those engines on, as they will in something under 5 minutes, it will be developing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The fuel that the astronauts are sitting on top of now would have to be carried in 54 railroad tank cars, 54 of them, to fuel that. Millions of pounds of fuel that they have. And in the first minute and 20 seconds of this flight, they'll use 2 million pounds of fuel.
Only negative reporting. If there's a problem only, will they come up on the air at this time? Now T-minus 4 minutes, 3 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
All going well there. Although what's in the minds of the astronauts, we can only surmise. My guess would be, having known a few of them over the years, that they are being very busy and very controlled. Their heartbeats are being monitored by doctors here at Cape Kennedy, but these men, and it's an important fact to remember, people say maybe we should send poets to the moon, maybe we should send writers to the moon, and that's all very well, but it's a terribly complicated flying job, calling for the very best pilots that we have in this country, and these men are, all of them, pilots. John Young was a Navy test pilot. He has 2 interesting records to his credit. He took a Phantom jet in 34 seconds from standing still on an airport apron to 9,280 feet in just about a half a minute. He also holds the altitude record for the Phantom jet, 80,000 feet. And today, he's going to have a ride that is indescribable, even when compared to that fast run he had in the Phantom jet, going to 9,000 feet. Now here's mission control.
Sequencer will pressurize the fuel tanks. These fuel tanks are pressurized to ensure that as the fuels deplete, they are forced down to assure an even flow into the engines. Fuel tanks are now being pressurized. The S4B, or third stage liquid oxygen tank, has just been pressurized, and the second stage liquid oxygen tank has been pressurized. As we move down through the count at the T-minus 17 second mark, we'll get a release of the guidance system in the instrument unit. Also handled by the automatic sequencer will be the release of swing arms number 1 and number 2. The ignition of the Saturn V 5 engines, the first stage 5 engines, will take place at 8.9 seconds in the countdown, 8.9 seconds. The engines will, or the vehicle will then be held down until we build up to 7.7 million pounds of thrust. At the T-minus 3 minute mark, tape recorders on board the spacecraft were turned on. These recorders record both voice and data. Spacecraft now to full internal cooling. The cooling load has been shared with a ground cooling. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. At T-minus 1 minute 15 seconds, the spacecraft batteries will be turned on for launch. These batteries will give an additional power source to the spacecraft, as well as be acting as a backup for the fuel cells. The third stage liquid hydrogen tanks now pressurized. All third stage tanks pressurized. Second stage tanks also pressurized. T-minus 1 minute, T-minus 1 minute and counting. Now moving into the final minute of the count. We'll be standing by for the switch over to internal power. Switch over taking place at this time, going on internal power. T-minus 45 seconds and counting. Guidance aligned, just announced by John Young. That will be the last action taken by the crew aboard the spacecraft. T-minus 35 and counting. Countdown continuing to go well. T-minus 30. T-minus 25, 24, 23, 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17. Guidance release. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engine's now building up to 7.7 million pounds of thrust. We have a launch commit and we have a liftoff. The swing arms moving back. The Saturn V lifting off the bow. Alpha pad building up thrust. We clear the tower. Houston is now controlling. Oh, we have good thrust in all 5. Roger. Pitch and roll program started. Roger. 16 now maneuvering to its proper flight path attitude. Mark 27 seconds. 36 seconds. Roll program completed. Pitch profile still in progress. 40 seconds. Mark 50 seconds. Cabin pressure relieving. Adjusting now from sea level to a space environment. 2 nautical miles in altitude. Stand by for 1 Bravo. Roger, wide from 1 Bravo. You're wet now, 16. Roger. That call up from Capcom Gordon Fullerton says Apollo 16 now capable of water landing. Mark 1 minute 12 seconds coming up on period of maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. One minute 22 seconds, 6 nautical miles in altitude, looking good. Mark 1 minute 30 seconds, 8 nautical miles in altitude. Mark 1 minute 41 seconds. Pass through max Q, still looking good. Through max Q and everything looks good. 16 now, 12.5 nautical miles in altitude. Young Duke Mattingly moving out to the outer traces of the Earth's atmosphere. Stand by for move 1 Charlie. Roger, we're Mark 1 Charlie. Mark 2 minutes 3 seconds, a status check and mission control by Flight Director Gene Kranz. A go, no go for staging. Coming up on center engine shutdown. If you're inboard, you're go for staging. Center engine shut down on time. 2 minutes 28 seconds, 26 nautical miles in altitude, 32 nautical miles downrange. 2 minutes 35 seconds. 2 minutes 40 seconds coming up on staging. Staging. Ignition on the S2. Roger. 2 minutes 53 seconds. A normal staging. Young Duke Mattingly now riding on 5 good second stage engines. Go on all 5 on the S2. 3 minutes 2 seconds. The giant first stage falling away now. It's a day's work completed. Apollo 16 now 46 nautical miles in altitude, 80 nautical miles downrange. Coming up on skirt sep and tower jettison. Roger. Tower jettison. Roger, and we confirm your skirt sep, your mode 2 now. Roger, mode 2. 3 minutes 28 seconds. The launch escape tower is ejected on time. Its surveillance role no longer required. Steering has converged, CMC is go. Roger. Mark 3 minutes 45 seconds. Apollo 16 now 62 nautical miles in altitude, 135 nautical miles downrange. Apollo 16 now 33 feet shorter and 9,000 pounds lighter. Unencumbered now for its mission in space. 16 Houston, 4 minutes, everything looks great down here. Everything looks good up here too. Mark 4 minutes 10 seconds. 70 nautical miles in altitude, 170 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 10,600 feet per second. Mark 4 minutes 30 seconds in mission control. Trajectory data driving right down the middle of our plot boards as expected. Right now flight path data is go.
That's what's left of the launch tower here on the ground.
Mark 4 minutes 45 seconds, 76 nautical miles in altitude, 220 nautical miles downrange.
Thousands of gallons of cooling water there on pad 39A. Millions of gallons.
Mark 5 minutes 10 seconds. Still good performance on all 5 second stage engines. Second stage shutdown predicted at 9 minutes 19 seconds.
16 Houston, times are nominal. Level sets will be 8 plus 3, 7, and cut off at 9er plus 1 9er. Roger.
Mark 5 minutes 40 seconds. Another status check in mission control by Flight Director Gene Krantz. His console is coming up all green, so looking good at this time.
5 for S4B to COI capability. Mark, you have it now.
That's an Air Force
Coming up
camera.
on 6 minutes with Capcom Gordon Fullerton reporting that 16 capable of reaching a minimum orbit with a good third stage and service module engines. We're at 6 minutes 8 seconds. Apollo 16, 88 nautical miles in altitude, 380 nautical miles downrange.
It's building up in...
Mark 6 minutes 30 seconds. Velocity now reading 14,880 feet per second. Altitude 90 nautical miles for Apollo 16. Downrange distance 440 nautical miles.
Stand by for S4B to orbit. Mark, you have it now. Roger.
They're going about 10,000
6
miles an
minutes
hour.
50 seconds.
Delta 40. Roger, Charlie.
Young Duke Mattingly now.
It's building up in...
Mark 6 minutes 30 seconds. Velocity now reading 14,880 feet per second. Altitude 90 nautical miles for Apollo 16. Downrange distance 440 nautical miles.
Stand by for S4B to orbit. Mark, you have it now. Roger.
They're going about 10,000
6
miles an
minutes
hour.
50 seconds.
Delta 40. Roger, Charlie.
Young Duke Mattingly now told that they can reach orbit if given a good third stage. Mark 7 minutes 91 nautical miles in altitude, 496 nautical miles downrange. Mark 7 minutes 15 seconds, 16 flying almost parallel over the ocean now with a young crew in a pitched down position. Really moving out now for downrange distance. We show Apollo 16 551 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 17,527 feet per second.
That's more than 10,000 miles an hour. At this moment, they have traveled 590 miles.
Coming up on center engine shutdown.
Roger, inboard.
Center engine shut down on time. 7 minutes 50 seconds. 92 nautical miles in altitude, 620 nautical miles downrange. Still showing stable thrust on the other 4 engines. They've got about a minute to go in burn time remaining.
16 at 8 minutes, looking good here.
That means the center The second stage center engine is not burning, but the outboard engines around it still have about 45 seconds of power left.
Mark, 8 minutes, 25 seconds.
Dean Houston, we saw the PU shift. Bus looks good, and you're go for staging.
Roger. 8 minutes, 35 seconds. Apollo 16, 93 nautical miles in altitude, 756 nautical miles downrange.
Full send time now.
Roger. That terse response from Apollo 16 Commander John Young. We're at 8 minutes, 52 seconds. Apollo 16 now 807 nautical miles downrange, 92 nautical miles in altitude. Velocity now reading 21,642 feet per second.
Now the big S4B engine, that's a very important one, has to ignite. And in about another 10 seconds you'll hear them talking about that.
Stand by for mode 4 capability. Mark, you have mode 4 now.
Okay, there was S2 shutdown.
Roger.
And we have S4B ignition. Mark, 10 minutes, 30 seconds.
Is good on the S4B.
Roger. The young crew has used up 2/3 of their Saturn stages on the way to orbit. We see good performance on the third stage, the S4B. That mode 4 report says Apollo 16 can achieve orbit on spacecraft power only. 9 minutes, 50 seconds. Apollo 16, 93 nautical miles in altitude, 1,011 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading at 23,654 feet per second.
Better than 13,000 miles an hour.
Mark, 10 minutes, 18 seconds. A status check in mission control for orbit.
Apollo 16 Houston, your go for orbit. Predicted cutoff 11 plus 49er.
Roger, 11:49.
They're still using that
Mark, 10 minutes, 40 seconds. Predicted time of shutdown, 11 minutes, 49 seconds. Apollo 16 now 93 nautical miles in altitude, 1,192 nautical miles downrange.
So in less than a minute, they'll turn that S4B engine off for a while.
Mark, 11 minutes, showing a build-up in velocity now reading 24,621 feet per second and accelerating. Mark, 11 minutes, 10 seconds.
That's the firing room here at Cape Kennedy.
Velocity now reading 24,887 feet per second.
You can see the Vice President on your screen above the man in the white shirt.
98% of the desired speed
That's where they press all the
for
buttons
insertion
to
into orbit.
go.
Less than 20 seconds now from time of shutdown.
Now they're going to turn that engine off.
Mark, 11 minutes, 40 seconds. Apollo 16 now 1,400 nautical miles downrange.
At 16,000 miles an hour.
Seco, right on.
So it's all working well up there, right on the dot.
That was shut down right on the money. Pitch 1 is coming off.
Roger.
Now, in about another minute, they are going to be in a parking orbit. I think maybe they're in that now. And they will stay in this parking orbit for a while. In about 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Mark, 12 minutes, 25 seconds.
Houston, the range safety system is safe. The orbit is go.
So they're in orbit.
Boy, it's just beautiful up here. Looking out the window, it's just really fantastic. And the thing worked like a champ.
Sure did. And we copy now 62, and your orbit by radar is 95 by 90.
Mark, 12 minutes, 54 seconds. That enthusiastic report from orbit was from Spacecraft Commander John Young. Apollo 16 in what appears to be a safe orbit. Preliminary numbers show a 95 nautical miles by 90 nautical miles. The Saturn V, once again, an apparent victor in its tug-of-war struggle with the Earth's forces of gravity. We're at 13 minutes, 20 seconds ground elapsed time, and Apollo 16 is in orbit.
In about 2 hours and 20 minutes, they will fire that S-4B engine again, and they'll run it for 6 minutes, and that will boost their speed from 14,000 miles an hour to 23,000 miles an hour, if you can comprehend.
Houston, the booster looks good. It's reconfigured for orbit.
And at that point, that'll be around 3:30 p.m. today, Eastern Standard Time, they will head for the moon. They are in a parking orbit now, and they will burn the engine again and head for the moon. My calculation is that should happen about 3:33 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. And as far as we can tell now, everything worked perfectly. John Young said this thing worked like a gem. That's the Vice President.
The administration's interest has not diminished, and as chairman of the Space Council, mine continues to accelerate as I look forward to 17 and to the Skylab launchings to follow. What's going to come after that will depend to a great extent on the continuation of your expertise and the great way you discharge your responsibilities. But you know that the people of this country still have that explorer spirit. They still have that tremendous sense of urgency for the United States to be the leader of the world in this kind of technological advance. So congratulations again for a superb job, and I never fail to marvel at the way you bring these things off. We're all with you, and we appreciate what you've done.
A sentiment shared by many of us. We do indeed never cease to marvel at the way they bring these things off. They brought it off today perfectly. A few small problems, easily handled, nothing very difficult at all. A brilliant launch, beautiful weather, punched right through the clouds there. There's some things that I find incredible about the size of that. Here you've got something that weighs 6.5 million pounds. And a minute and 20 seconds after it leaves the pad, with a sort of a great slowness about it, it's going 1,000 miles an hour. Many, many incredible things. We tape recorded the launch for those of you who saw it, for those few of you who may have missed it, and we're going to play it again now. Here, the launch of Apollo 16 today. Well, it was quite a sight. And they are now in an orbit between 90 and 95 miles up, going around the Earth. The astronauts in their space vehicle are in a parking orbit. Later this afternoon, they will punch a button on the spacecraft, fire up an engine. It will burn for 6 minutes. It will increase their speed to 23,000 miles an hour, It will pull them away from the gravitational field of the Earth and head them toward the gravitational field of the moon. So far, this day, for everybody concerned with Apollo 16, has gone perfectly. We'll have more on this story after this word from Gulf. Apollo 16 left the pad here at Cape Kennedy 19.5 minutes ago and is now safely up there, parked, going around the Earth. When it left here, when it lifted off the pad, it came under the control of the Manned Spacecraft Center at Houston, and Jim Hartz is there. Jim?
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. We were just resting in the circuit here for a second. There was a minor little problem. They could see on their consoles here on the ground what was called a possible blockage in a primary coolant loop. They didn't say much more than that. And so we assumed that perhaps it was one of the coolant loops in the suits. However, there are several systems on board the spacecraft which are used to keep it cool. And they asked John Young to check a switch or a dial in the spacecraft. He did, and just about 30 seconds ago they said, whatever you did, that corrected the problem. So they are well on their way, and this next hour and a half is spent mainly in checking the spacecraft systems. It goes through tremendous stresses at launch, and they want to make sure everything is in first-rate shape before they fire up the engine again and go on toward the moon. So it does require a great deal of checks on board the spacecraft and checks from the ground, and that again takes a little over an hour, and by 3:30 this afternoon they should have all that in shape, and if everything is in shape, they will go on. Now back to Gary Cutley in New York.
At about 4 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time, after the Apollo 16 spacecraft has left the Earth's orbit and has started its journey to the moon, there will be a very important maneuver. It's called transposition and docking. It's happened in all of the moon flights, and it's important because it has to be successful if the astronauts are to land on the moon's surface. And here's how it works briefly with our little toy here. This is the Apollo spacecraft as it is now and as it will be up to transposition and docking. The third stage rocket, this shield housing the lunar module and the command surface module here with the three-man crew up in front. Then they will separate like this, and they will turn around for the docking maneuver. I'll take this protective shield off so you can see the lunar module there. The crew will then, where they're using their own small rockets, will guide their vehicle back towards the lunar module, aiming for a small opening here, which they have to couple into. Of course, both vehicles will be going at a fantastic speed in space, but that is of no importance because they're both moving at the same speed. But it is a very difficult and delicate maneuver. On the last moon mission, they had to hit it rather hard to get this locking action. Once it is locked in, they will pull the lunar module, this spidery-looking piece of machinery, out of the third stage rocket. The third stage rocket will then have finished its mission. It'll be jettisoned. It'll be put on a trajectory towards the moon where it'll land on the surface to create seismic waves, which various instruments there will measure. And this is the Apollo 16 spacecraft, which will fly to the moon. The crew here, the service module here, this, the lunar module, which will separate, and the crew will land. And that's how they'll go to the moon. It's a very important maneuver, and we hope to have, expect to have live television pictures from the Apollo 16 spacecraft of this event. That'll be later this afternoon, about 4 o'clock Eastern Time. Now let's go back to John Chancellor at the Cape.
I think we can hear some conversation now, but we're going to lose it in just a minute. We've had conversation between the spacecraft and Houston. John Young said again, he said the view is just fantastic from up there. They have passed over the Canary Islands, and I guess they're out of touch now, and we've had a loss of signal, which is to be expected, and they will be picked up by other stations as they go around. And on the second revolution, they're going to make 2 revolutions of the Earth this afternoon before they head for the moon, and they'll do that over Australia. So that's where they are now. Let's see, if they've gone from the Canary Islands, they're probably over Africa at this moment, going about 14,000 miles an hour. And that is where we stand now in a mission that has just gone, as far as we can tell, perfectly. When they do get to the moon, here's the schedule for that. They now are in the air around the Earth. They're due to arrive on the moon on Wednesday. They are due to land on the moon Thursday afternoon, and they will have that day, next Thursday, the first of their drives around the lunar surface. They will have the second of their drives on Friday, and on Saturday they will have the third. Now, in those 3 days, they will travel about 25 miles in all on the surface of the moon. Then, next Sunday afternoon, they will leave the moon for the Earth, and they will go into orbit around the moon, and on Tuesday, they will leave the moon's gravitational pull and head for the Earth. On Wednesday, Ken Mattingly, Lieutenant Commander Thomas K. Mattingly II, the command module pilot, will get out and walk in space. That will be on Wednesday afternoon. And then splashdown in the Pacific is for the 28th of April, a Friday. And that will be 12 days in all, about as long as Apollo 15. They will go about 25 miles. Apollo 15 traveled 28 miles. They will have 21 hours out of the space capsule on the surface of the moon. The Apollo 15 astronauts had only 18 and a half hours. They will be on the surface of the moon for 73 hours. I think that's a record. Apollo 15 went only 67 hours. They are landing at a place called Cayley Plains in the Descartes Highlands on the moon, and they hope to pick up 195 pounds of rock samples. Now here's Roy Neal at Houston.
Hundreds of visitors showed up today here at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, and many of them are visiting the Space Museum right now. They watched the launch by television in a big auditorium in the same building, and now they're looking at exhibits. Over 1 million people tour this center every year, and among things they see are an actual command module that flew on Apollo 9. There's also a lunar landscape complete with a real spacesuit once used by astronaut Alan Bean, and replicas of all the tools that the astronauts will use on the surface of the moon. In contrast with the crowds at the Cape, 1,500 miles away, the visitors here today took the launch more calmly, but they are excited by the things they've seen, and most of them say they do plan to follow the flight on television. John?
Thank you, Roy. Lots of people here, too. We're going to have quite a large traffic jam as they all start to go back to have Sunday dinner, having seen one of the more spectacular shows of the year. Talking again about what they're going to be doing on the moon, these astronauts, when they land on the moon, will be landing at a higher altitude than any other astronauts have ever done. Charles Duke, who has surveyed the territory there, says it will be like landing in a valley at the top of a mountain. They're going to be about 7,400 feet higher in terms of the moon surface than Tranquility Base, where Neil Armstrong became the first American or first man to walk on the moon. They're going to be landing several hundred miles to the north and to the west of Hadley Rill, where Apollo 15 landed, and about which we now, all of us, know quite a lot. So it's the first landing in the lunar highlands in the highest territory ever surveyed. The men are on a new diet. They found that the Apollo 15 astronauts developed irregular breathing, irregular beating of the heart. The rhythms of the heart were disturbed by the moon, and that is called arrhythmia, I believe, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it. What it means is that the heart beats in an irregular way, and when they looked into this, they found that the gravity on the moon is so light that they were losing potassium ions. The gravity has something to do with that, and I'm not quite sure what that is, but they are now on a potassium-rich diet, and presumably that irregularity won't happen again. We'll be back with more of our coverage of Apollo 16 after this word from Gulf.